Hello everybody, my name is Tuomo, and in this video I will show you how to create a text input component in React and how to add Slack or Facebook-like mentions to it. So when you type in @character and start typing a person's name, you can select them, and after that their name comes highlighted and you mention them that way. After this video you will have a component that you can use in your own application, and I will also show you how you can extract the mentioned data from the component so you can, for example, save the mentioned users to a database. It's funny that almost all modern applications with chatting features have this mention functionality in them, but I remember when I was trying to implement mention functionality to my own application for the first time, it was very hard to find any tutorials or guides how to actually do it. So hopefully this video will save you some of the trouble that I went through when I was trying to figure it out for the first time. We don't have to code the whole thing from scratch, and we can actually use a couple of libraries that do most of the heavy lifting for us. Since we are writing more than just text to the text input, the input will basically need to be a rich text editor. For this we'll use Draft.js, which is a rich text editor framework for React. Don't worry if you know nothing about it. I will show you everything you need to know in order to get this component working. But I highly recommend that you check it out because it's a very powerful library and it has many pretty awesome features also. I actually have a course on Draft.js basics on Skillshare, which is perfect for someone who is beginner in Draft.js. So if that's you, I'll leave a link below so you can check it out. And I should also mention that if you are new to Skillshare, you can actually get the course for free. Second library we will use is Draft.js plugins. They have a bunch of useful plugins for Draft.js, including a mention plugin. All of the plugins work out of the box. So for adding mentions to our editor, we basically only need to provide a list of users that can be mentioned, and the plugin will take care of the rest. I bet you are already eager to get started on this, so enough of talking and let's get to coding. I will use the Code Sandbox IO. If you're not familiar with Code Sandbox, it's basically a web development IDE for the browser. And we can create something called sandboxes, which are these development environments. And since we are doing React, we'll choose the React sandbox. And on the left here, we get our folder structure. On the middle is the file that is open, the code editor, and on the right we have a preview of the application. So first thing I'm gonna do is I'll actually delete the app component since we won't be using that. And inside the index.js, I'll remove the app reference or references. Then I'll create a new file and call it text input. This will hold the component for our editor. And I will write a simple component here first, and then we will add features to it. So first I'll import React. Then I'll create a class. And inside of it, for now, I just add a render method. And at the end, I will export default this component. Save the file, flip back to the index.js, and I'll import the text input component. And render it inside the render method. Once we save, we get our text displayed. Great. Now let's open the text input file, and as we discussed, we need Draft.js and the mention plugin for our editor. So first I'll add them as dependencies, and in Code Sandbox we can do it from the Dependencies section with the Add Dependency button. And first we'll add Draft.js. And for the mentions we need the Draft.js plugins editor. And the mention plugin. Good. Now we have our dependencies installed, then let's import them. I will import something called editor state from the Draft.js library. This editor state is basically an object that represents the editor's state. Again, if you want to learn more about Draft.js, go ahead and check the link below in the description for the online course. Next, we'll import the editor component from the Draft.js plugins editor. So whenever we use Draft.js plugins, we actually want to use the editor component from the Draft.js plugins editor library. If we didn't use any plugins, we would use editor component from the Draft.js library. Next, I'll add a state for our component. And inside of it, we will define the editor state. And we'll create an empty editor state at first. So we'll call editor state dot create empty. Next, let's actually render the editor. I'm gonna wrap this editor inside of a div. And let's add the editor component. And the editor component takes a few props. First of them is the editor state, which is the editor state from the state. Then we need to define an onChange handler. So whenever a user types in the editor, this handler is triggered, and we didn't yet define this, so let's write this.onChange here and define it next. So what our onChange handler will do is just update the component's state with the new editor state. So onChange, and it gets the editor state object as a parameter. And inside of here, let's update the state with setState. Now, when we save and check our preview here, it seems that we have only a white page, but if you put your mouse in the top section of the page, you can see that the cursor changes. So we have a text input here. If we click it and write something, we can see that we have an editor there. So before we move on, let's add some styles so we can see our editor better. To do this, I will just use the default styles that came with the mentioned plugin. So if we check out again, here are some basic styles for the editor we can use. So I'll copy these and create our own file. And since we are using CSS modules, we want to name it as editorstyles.module.css, so the build system understands that we want to use CSS modules with this file. And then paste in the CSS and save it. Then inside of the text input component, I will import the styles to a variable called editor styles. So import editor styles. Like this. And then I can define the styles for the editor with the class name and editor styles.editor. So now when I save the file, we can see that there comes a little borders for our component, and it's also a bit bigger. And if we type something, we can see that there is also some padding. So next, let's actually add the mentioned plugin. So from the mention plugin, I want to import create mention plugin and something called default suggestions filter. So with this create mention plugin, we actually create the plugin, And this default suggestions filter is a function that we will use to filter out the mentions when we are typing in the person's name. Next, we will need to create the mention plugin, and let's create it in the constructor of this component. So let's define a constructor, and we will define the mention plugin with create mention plugin, like this. Now we have the plugin created and saved in the mention plugin variable. Next, let's hop in the render method, and in here we'll extract from the mention plugin the actual component that shows the mention suggestions, and then we will create a plugins array that contains our mention plugin. So first let's extract the suggestions component. It's called mention suggestions, and we will take it from the just created mention plugin. And then we'll define a plugins array, and inside of here we will just pass mention plugin. So how the Draft.js plugins editor work is that you can pass in array of plugins, so you can have multiple plugins on one editor, and that's the reason why we are creating an array of the plugins and not just passing in the mention plugin itself. Next, we'll pass the plugins prop for the editor. And then we will place the mention suggestions component below the editor. And there are a few props that this component will receive. First is an onSearch change handler, which is triggered whenever we type in the add character and start typing the person's name. So inside of this handler we will filter out the mention suggestions based on the text that the user is typing. So let's add onSearch change, and we'll pass this dot onSearch change. And we haven't yet defined this, so let's do that right now. So this handler will receive an object that has a property value that holds the current value that the user is typing for the mention username. And with that we will need to filter out the suggestions accordingly. But before we do that, we need to add the users that we can mention to our app and add them to our state. So that's something we didn't do yet. So first I'll create a new file called mentions.js. So inside of this file we will place all the users that we are able to mention from our component. You could fetch this data from, for example, an API, but for the simplicity of this example we will just import them from the JavaScript file. And I will actually go back to the mention plugin page, and they have a bunch of example users we can use nicely set in a JavaScript array. So I'm actually gonna copy all this and paste it in to our file and save the file. Then flip back to the text input component and import the mentions, and then add the mention users to our state. I will call them suggestions. So now we have the users that can be mentioned in our state inside of the suggestions variable. Now let's hop back to the onSearch change handler. So what we wanna do here is to update the suggestions variable inside of our state by filtering the mention users with the default suggestions filter, which we imported from the mention plugin. So let's type in this.setState. And now we wanna update the suggestions variable. And here we can call the default suggestions filter method and pass in as a first value the filter text we want to use, so in this case the value variable, and the second parameter is the array that we want to filter, and it will be the mentions. Let's save the file and go back to the mention suggestion component and pass in a suggestions prop, which will be the suggestions variable from the state. And when we save, we can see that we no longer get an error. And now if we type in some text and type in the @character, we get some names and images. So these are the users that we can mention. But as we can see, they are not styled. So let's add the default styles for the mention plugin also. Let's flip back to the mention plugin documentation, and up here we can import the default styles for the mention plugin with this line. So let's copy it and paste it up here, and I'll save the file, and let's try again. Now we get nicely styled mention suggestions, and we can select one and we see that the user is highlighted on the editor. Then we can add a new one, and as we type, it filters out the possible users we can select. Now we have an editor component where we can add text and mentions to different users. If this was in a real application, we would also want to extract the mentioned data somehow out of the editor, so we can do different things based on who was mentioned and who was not. So next, let's demonstrate this by adding two buttons under our editor, one for extracting the whole content of the editor and one for extracting just the mentioned users out of the editor. So I'll go down to the render method and add a couple of buttons. And I'll add in the on-click handlers. We will define them in just a second. So this one will be for extracting the whole editor's data. And the second button will be for extracting dimensions. Like this. Then let's add in the click handlers. Let's leave them empty for now, and I'll add the mention one also, like this. And it looks like I have a typo there. I'll just fix it. And one more thing, let's add in a wrapper div for these two divs, since we need to return just one element out of the component. Okay, now we have two buttons, and first let's create the extract data function for extracting the whole data out of the editor, so we can take it and, for example, save it to a database. So what we want to do is get the current content out of the editor and then convert it to JSON. So first I'll define a variable called content state, and we can get the content state of the editor with getCurrentContent method. So let's type in this.state.editorstate.getCurrentContent. Then, in order to convert it to JSON, Draft.js provides a helper function called convertToRaw that takes a content state variable as a parameter and returns the JSON version of that content state, which then can be saved, for example, to a database. So let's go back up here and import the convertToRaw method from Draft.js. And back in the extract data method, I'll define a new variable called, let's say, raw equals, and now I'll call the convertToRaw with the content state parameter. And now we will have the JSON representation of the editor's current content inside of this raw variable. So if we, for example, wanted to save the content to a database, this would be the variable that we save in it. But since we are not saving this to anywhere, let's just console log it so we can inspect it. Like this. Now let's save and try to input some data to our editor. And now I'll actually open the console from the code sandbox. And now when I click the extract data button, I can see that we get an object logged in our console. And inside of it, we have two variables, blocks and entity map. And if we click it a little bit more open, we can see that there is our text and something called entity ranges with offset and length properties. These are something that we won't cover here, but they basically define if there is some entities inside of this text. So in this case, it defines that from the offset 6, 8 characters belongs to an entity with key 0. Again, if you want to learn more about these, check out the Draft.js docs or the course that I left the link below. Then we also have an entity map property, which has an object, and there we have an object type of mention, and in the data property we have a mention object, and inside of it we actually have the data for the mention that we added here. So this is the same data that we have in our mentions.js file here. So we can see that our content is structured inside of the JSON object, and also the mention data is inside of it. Now let's add a functionality to extract the mentions out of the content state. So inside of the extract mentions handler, I will do the same thing. First take the content state out of the editor and then convert it to JSON. So I'll copy paste these two lines. Next, I'll define an array where I will store all of the mentions from the editor. I'll call it mention to users, and then I will type again and log the data. If we open this up, we can see that we have the entity map object, and inside of it we will have an object for every entity we have in the editor. And in this case, the entities are dimensions. And if we open up the object a little more, we can see that we have the type information there, and what we want to do is take every mention or every object that has type of mention and save the data.mention object to this mentioned users array. So let's loop through this entity map and check if the type is mentioned, and if it is, let's take the data.mention and save it to the mentioned users array. So let's type in 4. So we will get the key for each object in the entity map. Next, I'll define the current entity. So const ent. We can get it with the key from the entity map object. Now let's make the check that if the type is mention, and if it is, let's push data.mention object to the mentioned users array. So mentioned users.push and ent.data.mention. And at the end we can now just log the mentioned users. But if you have an application that you want to use this in and you want to do something else with the mentioned users, you will now have the array of the mentioned users available. So I'll save the file and let's add in some text. And now let's click the extract mentions button. We can see that we get an array with two objects, and that's because we have two mentions now. And if we expand these, we can see that we get dimensions nicely placed inside of the array. Okay, that's it. Now we have a text input component that supports mentions. And we are also able to extract the mention data out of it, so we can, for example, save the mentions to a database. I'll leave a link below to the code sandbox I worked on, so you can check that out. But that's all for now. If you found this video helpful, please hit that like button. If you have any questions, I would be more than happy to answer them, so drop a comment below. And if you are not already, please be sure to subscribe. See you next time.